It's my nerd world, and welcome to it, a Star Wars show. I'm your host, Jon Justice, here to talk about the ACOLYTE season finale and the series itself. Now, my expectation is that I'll probably be talking about this show over the next few episodes. So what I'll be sharing with you this week on the show is, again, sort of my instinctive reaction to the season finale and a little bit about how we arrived here and my overall thoughts, sort of my quick overall thoughts of the series in and of itself. I want to be able to spend some time watching it in its entirety, and I have some thoughts about actually watching some of the other episodes at different portions or different places, like out of order than the way it was released on Disney+. And I talked a bit about that on last week's show. Now, I'm going to start off a little differently this week. I want to go to listener feedback to kick things off today. Got a few emails that rolled in, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, and I felt for this week's episode it was more appropriate to address those emails talking about last week's show, and then we'll get into the ACOLYTE Episode 8 and the season finale. Remember, if you want to email me at any time, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. If you're enjoying the show on YouTube, leave a comment there, and I'll certainly share it on next week's episode.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
All right, first we hear from Mike Rotunda, who says, Episode 7, John, I was so frustrated. 10 seconds, right? The flash, I was FF 10 seconds because nothing new was being shown or said. It was literally episode 3. It took to the 27-minute mark for us to actually get new content or information. I was very disappointed. It was probably the worst written Star Wars I'd ever seen. I'm glad for anyone who likes it. I understand everyone is different, and a lot of fans may like this, but me personally, I don't like it. I wish I did. I didn't understand anything. Sol never met Osha in his life. Then suddenly, in 1 minute, he sees Osha, and for the first time, he's absolutely positively has a connection to her. Why? Why does he basically kidnap a child who he's never seen before, and why is he so attracted to her? They made us hang on to this series, waiting and waiting for them to explain what happened 16 years ago, and when we get it, it makes no sense. They showed us episode 3 2 times. This story is just spinning its wheels. It goes nowhere. Now, one episode left, and how are they going to explain everything? Why did Osha not be a Jedi? Why did Sol kidnap her only to let her go? Why did Quamir say to Sol, you don't recognize me? And we still don't know the twins' motivation. Very poor show. I'm very disappointed. And there's a lot of criticism around this show, Mike, right? And as I always say, this entertainment is subjective. And I've got my own complaints with the show, but I oddly have this weird attraction and enjoyment of this show that I'll get into. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts, Mike, on how they did wrap everything up and whether or not your questions were answered. Because based off of what you said in your email to me, it sounds like they did go and answer many of the questions that you had. Friend of the show, Shlomo, excuse me. He's answering the question that I had based off of episode 7, and that was, why did the entire coven of witches die after Indara removed Coral from Kelnaka? And he writes, you're surprised at the witches dying when Indara evicted them from his head seems to confuse what happened. Indara severed their connection and trapped them all in Kelnaka. They eventually drove him mad, leading him to isolate himself. He has coven symbols drawn all over the walls of his crashed ship. I think it's a nod to the Matrix, like pulling the plug on somebody in the Matrix. Thus, Indara Trinity pulling their plug. I believe that the mother-child abuser escaped. She vapored out. She also said something interesting. Fight me. It's the same thing that May said when fighting Indara. Maybe, right, Shlomo. I'm not sure if that works, though, entirely, because the situation with my impression was Kelnaka simply went and isolated himself after all those events 16 years ago because he was just as ashamed of what had happened as the rest of the Jedi involved were. With regard to why all the Witch Coven died, perhaps it was indeed Indara disconnecting them, and because of that disconnection, they all ended up passing away. But I certainly did not get the connection that all of the witches were inside Kelnaka and remained to be in Kelnaka. So I'm still a bit confused on that, and to be honest, I hadn't thought much about it since last week's episode. I'll try to do some digging and see if I cannot get an absolute answer on that particular question. And then Ray 2117 writes, in the event if next week's finale, which I'll be talking about here in a moment, doesn't deliver on a high note and therefore leads to concern, just remember 2.5 months ago we were given one of the greatest finales we've ever had since Rebels, and that was the Bad Batch Season 3. We still have better Star Wars out there, and we'll always have them. Always positive, Ray 2017. Thank you for the feedback. All right, and again, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. So let's get to the season finale, and I'll give you my instinctive reaction thoughts on the Acolyte Episode 8.
This is not going to go the way you think.
This was probably one of the strangest Star Wars rides that I've ever been on. I really enjoyed this final episode. I still have a few questions. The show is not without its flaws. There's no doubt about that at all. But even with its flaws, my standard of, is it worthwhile entertainment? Is it something that I'm going to want to rewatch? Does it have rewatchability? And this show absolutely does for me. I feel like I have this bizarre relationship with it. And a lot of it is due to everything outside of the show that doesn't have anything to do actually with the content of the show itself. So let me run through this quickly. When this was first announced, 4 years ago, this was the most excited I was for a new live-action Disney Plus Star Wars streaming show. What was being promoted was a show that was dark side-centric. Again, based some 100 years before the events of the Phantom Menace, just outside the High Republic era. This would show us how the Jedi would be corrupted eventually by the Sith, as we saw in the Phantom Menace. What we got was a show that was much different from that. In the end, it ended up fulfilling its promise. And perhaps that's on me, the viewer, and not so much the story that they set out to tell. Because you can still apply that description from 4 years ago to what we ended up getting. In my head, I went to a different place with this, relating to how the Sith would eventually come to infiltrate the Jedi Council the way that they did with Palpatine. It's clear, but it's not in the way that I had expected. They did it in a much more subversive fashion in showing that this particular group of Jedi got caught up in these events, and there ended up being a massive cover-up. And I know that there's complaints out there talking about how this paints the Jedi in a negative light. And I understand the rationale of those arguments. But at the same time, I also think that, for me, looking at it from the angle of, well, this was a singular event in a group of Jedi who, all of which, apart from one that decided to cover up that wasn't directly involved in that event that brought about the story that we ended up seeing, they all ended up paying the ultimate price. Vanestra clearly has her own motivation for going and keeping this hidden, but in keeping it hidden, it does damage to the Jedi ultimately because they're not given the truth about what actually took place, and therefore the alarms aren't raised that the Sith are trying to return, that people are out there wielding the dark side. The Jedi have already shown to be flawed. I mean, you go back to Revenge of the Sith, and you go to Yoda's commentary on the gunship before before Yoda heads off to Kashyyyk in that film, and he says, that they're not, it was a prophecy they may have misread. They're not seeing the dark side rising. Palpatine came to power right under their noses. I mean, the Jedi ended up being flawed in as much as they allowed the Empire to rise to power. So, getting back to the outside influences on this, and you may have felt this way even if you weren't aware of all of the controversies surrounding it. I think a lot of the division around this show just ended up exploding exponentially based off of that third episode, and it never quelled to the point where the show had a chance to recover. Now, I know the viewership has been decent on it, but I don't think we're going to get a second season on this. So getting back to my hype and leading up to this episode itself, then we had the marketing of it early on, and I was kind of impressed with a few of the images that first showed up for it. We had a lightsaber blade, a lightsaber hilt that looked like it had a blade attached to it, but ended up being a strip of blood in the original teaser poster for it, and so this was certainly forecasting that this was going to be a darker show, and it certainly was a darker show in all respects. It had its lighter sort of Star Wars goofy moments, but at the same time, in terms of the death involved, the nature of some of those deaths, including this final episode, and some of its more adult themes, with Quimir, traipsing off, skinny dipping in the lake, and the fact that scene, the dynamic between him and Osha, certainly ended up becoming something of an attraction. I'm not going to say romance, because I don't think it was necessarily a romance. I think at the end of this episode, Osha made the decision to go and spare her sister based off of everything that had transpired. But I also think there's a part of Osha that wanted to go with Quimir, and certainly they were holding hands. I heard another podcaster make a comment that if there's no sequel to this, their headcanon is that Quimir and Osha basically go off on their own. They may have their own dabbling within the dark side, but it was their opinion that they kind of cut loose of all of it and go live their lives someplace out in the galaxy somewhere and don't end up becoming this formidable master-apprentice duo. Now, if there's a second season, of course, that certainly could be the case. And then we ended up getting some of the first teasers for the show and the trailers, and I was really getting concerned based off of what I was seeing in those teasers. And then, unfortunately, the press surrounding the show, for me personally, it really tainted a lot of it and really lowered my expectations based off of some of the nonsense that was being said during the press coverage around this show. Ultimately, what matters is what we watch in the episodes. The rest of it doesn't matter. But it's hard when you follow this stuff and you see actors in the show making ridiculous comments like Anakin Skywalker blew up the Death Star and there's no good or bad, or actresses talking about the patriarchy in Star Wars. I wish that we could get back to a place where we just talk about the storytelling and we don't end up injecting it with so much added commentary that's unnecessary. It used to not be like that. The interviews that were done with the creators around these shows, and you go back and watch any of the documentaries, and I probably watched every documentary relating to Star Wars that's been put out there. And there is an absolute difference between the documentaries that we got through the prequels and even the early part of the sequel trilogy, where they just talked about the filmmaking process, how personally they were excited for the story, what they were hoping that people would get out of it. And unfortunately, we've reached another level. And because of all of the press coverage and the commentary from show creators, actors, and actresses, there was a lot of embedded frustration before the first episode even dropped. And then once it did, the fallout was on, and there were a lot of YouTubers that stand to make a lot of money being negative, and I've had my own complaints about this show. Honestly, I think this show is pretty solid if you remove, like Mike Rotunda said, who emailed, if you remove episodes 3 and 7, or just make them one episode. or go and take them and put them at the very beginning. Watch episodes 3 and 7 as the lead up, so you get all the 16-year backstory, and then start at episode 1 and watch all the other episodes. That's the way that I intend to watch it later, or I'll just skip those 2 episodes because I know the background of what had happened. The show swung for the fences, and because it swung for the fences, it had some pretty big misses, but what did land, it really worked for me. So I don't want to go back too far and begin talking about the rest of the season. Let me talk about this final episode, because I really also, like the email, did not know how they were going to go and wrap this series up. And I thought that they did a really fantastic job in wrapping it up. We were left in episode 6 with Osha putting the helmet on. We go back to that scene where she's clearly succumbing to the dark side in some way. And through the helmet, she's able to tap into a power where she can go and envision the future. And through that, she sees the death of Sol at either her or May's hands. Quamir is along for the ride. He wants an acolyte in all of this. And because of that, he decides he's going to go with her as she attempts to go and confront the situation that she saw in her vision between May and Sol. I also thought it was interesting when the helmet came off after that moment, and he tells her, you can see you had a vision of the future, that she was breathing in an almost identical fashion as Rey did in The Last Jedi after she went into the dark side cave during Luke's training on Ahch-To. I thought that was, I don't know if it was intentional. If it was, then that was a really, really good nod. If it wasn't, it's a cool little addition, because that's what I thought. And this whole show has very much the vibes and feels like it's built off of The Last Jedi. Like this and The Last Jedi, I think, go together very well, which is probably adding to so much of the controversy, because prior to The Acolyte, The Last Jedi was the most controversial piece of Star Wars content ever made. In the meantime, we had the situation occurring between May and Sol on the ship. I didn't necessarily care for the tease once again when Sol is about to tell her what it is that they are in being sisters, but they're not really sisters. May ends up escaping, and we have one of the coolest sequences of the entire series, just because I've been clamoring for some spaceship action, and that sequence didn't disappoint. As a matter of fact, in the second book in my EMBARK science fiction series, I have an action sequence that is near identical to the one that took place in The Acolyte. Now, an interesting side note to that is, in the Art of the Force Awakens book, there is a piece of artwork at the very beginning of the book where it shows the Millennium Falcon flying through the rings of a planet, much in the same way of what we saw in this episode. And I was immediately reminded not only of my own story, because I'm kind of seeing what I had envisioned in my mind when I wrote that sequence in Treasure in Darkness, available on Amazon. Search for EMBARK and Jon Justice. But I also immediately recalled that piece of art that was in the art book. The one thing about that sequence, though, that bugged me, and it's very, very minor, was as they both started to get out of control, especially when May's ship started to get out of control as they were heading towards the planet Brendok below, at one point she says, "Hang on, Pip." And it stuck out to me because Pip wasn't her droid. Pip was May's droid. Pip was Osha's droid. And Osha and Pip had the chemistry together. She hijacked Pip so that he would go and do her bidding, but I felt it was a little bit out of character for May to tell Pip to hold on, considering that they didn't really have a relationship beyond utility of what he could do. And then once we got on Brendok, I really thought the way the sequence of events played out was spectacular. Before I get any further than that, let me jump back to when they leave the planet, when Quamir and May leave the planet, and we get that brief cameo of Plagueis. So I'm curious to go and hear from you, talkshownerd@gmail.com, and what your theories are. I'm also going to do some investigating on Reddit myself of how people thought of that inclusion of Darth Plagueis in the series and what they felt his inclusion was for. Because there's a number of different angles I think you can take. One, so was he training with Quimir, or was he simply watching over Quimir? My understanding is in the timeline in terms of the storytelling, Darth Plagueis may have been the apprentice to another Sith called Tenebrous. I think that's how you say his name. And Tenebrous is a Sith who is the same species as the Cantina aliens from in the band, in the original A New Hope. So he's that same species. What I've seen of the artwork, he looks much more menacing as a Sith than the band members do in the Cantina on Tatooine in A New Hope. So I'm not exactly sure why he was placed on that planet watching them go and what for. I would assume that it's got to be a connection with Quimir. Quimir is looking for an acolyte to train. He wants the power of two, so perhaps this is just part of their training together. But I also am convinced that Plagueis is there to give us, for those fans that follow this enough and pay attention, I think the casual fan knows of the famous Squid Lake scene, the opera scene in Revenge of the Sith between Palpatine and Anakin. I mean, J.J. Abrams referenced that in the making of The Rise of Skywalker, saying that one of the motivations that he had for bringing Palpatine back was that scene when he tells the story of Darth Plagueis the Wise. You know, he was a Sith that found out how to cheat death, and this is where Anakin ended up turning to the dark side because he wants to tap into the power because Plagueis' apprentice killed him and took his power. That, of course, was Palpatine. So, getting back to the Acolyte, his inclusion to me would signal that the whole reason why the twins were created, the Virgins, was because of Plagueis. He had granted that power to the witches. Instead of making one, they made two, which would keep the Anakin Force Virgins intact and doesn't spoil how unique it is and special as it should be, Anakin was in being the Virgin's birth. Okay. So that was why I felt that Plagueis was included in the series. And I was hoping to see Plagueis in the series. That's what I was wanting. I was like, listen, all the Space Witch stuff wasn't really jibing with me. The power of one, power of two, power of many. I just didn't feel like it landed. I know that the Night Sisters did it, but it was done much better in animation. It was done much better in Ahsoka. I just didn't think they pulled it off in the Acolyte. And the relationship in and of itself, and I created them, I birthed them. Well, now we have the understanding and we know why. They were a virgins in the Force, at least Soul thought they were, and because they ended up making two, Soul was under the impression that anybody with that power shouldn't be allowed to live. I feel like in the moment, Soul thought he was doing the right thing in saving May. And I talked about this on the episode last week when I was going through episodes 6 and 7. And especially 7, when she decided to turn into witch vapor and began to vaporize May, Soul's not knowing what's going on, and says in episode 8 that a power like that's too strong of a power to be left alive. It's kind of an echo going back to Revenge of the Sith and Mace Windu when he has his lightsaber to Palpatine's neck. He's too dangerous to be left alive. I felt like it was an echo back to that. The lightsaber, the lightsaber battles in this show, that alone, whichever episode it was, I don't know, it was 4 or 5, 4. I think it was 5, because in 3 was the weird one. 4, they do the Hobbit through the forest, and then 5 we get the confrontation between the Jedi and Jekki bites it, which still bums me out. But the lightsaber work and the fight scenes in this were absolutely top notch, just fantastic. My favorite has been the sequels, and specifically The Rise of Skywalker, and this just blew it out of the water. And this final confrontation between Quimir, the Stranger, and Soul just did not disappoint on any level. There was one slow-mo shot when they were jumping down I thought was interesting. Maybe unnecessary, but it didn't take me out of the moment by any stretch. We have Venestra and the Jedi showing up afterwards. You see their ship arriving while the battle is going on. There was a moment in time when I thought that perhaps this was going to be Plagueis showing up, but ended up being Venestra. And then, of course, we have the pivotal moment where Sol finally admits that he killed the mother, and we end up seeing Osha's turn to the dark side. And I was sitting there hoping that they were going to do it. They focused in on the Kyber crystal inside her lightsaber hilt, and I know that it's been written that the Kyber crystal sabers can bleed depending on where what part of the Force you're tapping into. And I can't remember what book it was in originally, but that has been shown in canon. The sabers do bleed. And that the green and the blue lightsabers, my understanding, and feel free to email me and correct me if I'm wrong, is that, they have specific meanings depending on those who wield them. And I know you can get particular colors of lightsaber crystals, Kyber crystals, but if you turn to the dark side, they'll end up bleeding red. Rey's ends up being yellow at the end of The Rise of Skywalker. When she flips it on at the end of The Rise of Skywalker, you can see the blue and the green of both Leia and Luke sort of flash before it goes yellow, So there's that. That being said, in my view, I always took it as she's balanced the Force for now, and her lightsaber is going to be yellow. Anyways, in the moment, I was like, please let it bleed, please let it bleed. And they did a fantastic job. You can actually see the red take over and infect the blue Kyber crystal, and then the saber actually go and the hilt go up and change color. I just thought that was awesome. We actually get to see a turn, and we don't get to see the turns, or we haven't seen. I like seeing turns. I'm not going to lay out how many times we've seen a turn to the dark side in animation or in live action. I'm just saying that in that moment, it's really, really cool to see the turn take place. And then, of course, you get this moment where will she, won't she, and Osha ends up fulfilling what she saw in the vision that brought her to Brendok in killing Sol, because he ended up killing her mom. And so you get a resolution as to what everything happened, like it or not. Sol ends up paying the price. But it's one of these shows where, there's not a lot of winners in it. And I know that's rough. As a matter of fact, I heard from my father. He's probably going to laugh at this, and I thought about it after he hung up the phone, because he and my stepmom had called, and they wanted to know my thoughts on the show and run through a few things, which got my creative juices flowing. I wasn't going to record a podcast until tomorrow, but I'm like, well, I'm thinking Star Wars. I'll go ahead and record one now. But I'm wondering if my dad had a problem because he didn't necessarily like the way that the finale ended, if it was because we didn't really get any heroes in the end of this whole thing. And that's different for Star Wars. You have Quimir and Osha going off on their own because she agrees to be her acolyte. If he spares May, he ends up mind force wiping May. And then you have Venestra going back to the council and essentially covering the whole thing up. Now, I did wonder, what was the meaning behind the visit with Yoda? Was she just going to go and give him a recap of the events that took place and tell her version? You have to assume that because the Jedi, believed that the Sith had been extinct for a millennia. And so you have to assume that she went to go see a Master Yoda simply to go and tell her version of what had laid out. But there were no winners in all of this. And again, at the end, we end up getting that dark side story that they promised those 4 years ago. I really like these final 2 episodes, being 6 and 8. I'm kind of like with Mike. I could do without the Episode 7, except for the fact that Episode 7 certainly had a lot more action and better lightsaber sequences than Episode 3 did, but it didn't do a very good job with the Rashomon, and I'm not going to go and retread that again. I did that a couple episodes ago. But I'm also kind of a hopeless romantic, and even seeing these dark side characters get together, I thought was pretty interesting. It was almost a Reylo fulfilled in that prior to the release of The Rise of Skywalker, there were a lot of Reylo fans that were actually wondering and asking the question, well, what if Rey had gone and actually taken Kylo Ren's hand? And they both ended up turning to the dark side, and a lot of artwork made based off of that. So I thought it was interesting that we got this version of Reylo and a payoff where these two individuals end up with each other at the end with this attraction, maybe turning into a romance, but both very broken characters and having alliances to the dark side. You strip away all of the commentary, the controversy, and everything surrounding the show, and this was a really interesting and unique and brave effort on Lucasfilm's part in the story. It's definitely flawed, but watching this final episode, I was reminded there's a lot of goofy stuff in Star Wars. And this isn't to forgive some of the weird editing choices. This isn't to provide an excuse for any of the things that just didn't work in the show. There's actors in the show I just didn't understand. Whoever the Jedi character was that was, I think it was Venestra's apprentice. I don't know who that dude was, but you could have got a better actor for that role. Some of the decisions that were made in other episodes by characters didn't make sense, but overall, in retrospect, I actually feel like the short run times on the episodes played to its benefit because it moved at such a fast clip that those nitpicks that I have, or larger issues like some of the editing choices, I can blow past them and it doesn't ruin the experience for me because at the end I got a really interesting story set in a timeline that's completely unfamiliar. We got new locations, amazing action sequences, and we got to see this other version of dark side and light side and how it can impact people in a way that we hadn't seen before, including seeing two dark side characters come together at the end. My guess is this show over time will get a lot more credit than it is now, because I'm guessing that a lot of people don't like it. There's no doubt about that. But I think a lot of people are going to see it like me. If they don't already love it now, they're kind of like me. They're like, all right, I was entertained, and I'll go back and watch it. I'll go back and watch this again before I'll go back and watch Kenobi, before I go back and watch the Book of Boba Fett, before I go back and watch Andor. Maybe not Ahsoka. But there are aspects of this show that I actually thought were more interesting than Ahsoka as well. But getting back to, there's goofy stuff in Star Wars all the time. There is. I mean, come on, when you get to Return of the Jedi and the Ewok stuff, even I have a hard time with the Ewoks throwing rocks and sticks and beating up the stormtroopers. It's just kind of okay. When you go back to the prequel trilogy and you look at Jar Jar, and I was somewhat bothered by the tracker Basil character, but I'm like, well, while I wouldn't have my kids watch this when they were younger, based off of all the death, the killing, and the minor, sort of leaning into adult themes with skinny dipping and checking out, individuals as they're walking out of a lake without any clothes on. And you don't see them, but there certainly is an insinuation that Osha was checking the dark side dude out. I know they want to include some characters in there that are going to appeal to the young people for those parents that do go and let them watch this show. It's an oddity that I have that I confusingly enjoyed, and I'm wondering why I'm excited to go back and watch it again. And that probably really just comes down to so much of the criticism. I've watched a lot of criticism videos, and some of them, they're really funny, and they all make really, really great points. But then I sit back and go, yeah, but I was entertained, and I kind of want to go watch it again. So what does that say? At the end of the day, I imagine that's all the creators can go in and hope for. So we'll see what ends up coming of it, and we end up getting another season out of it. I'm certainly not holding my breath based off of all the controversy, but you just never know. All right, hey, thanks for checking this episode out. If you want to read some more science fiction space opera stories, way less controversial, good versus evil, freedom and liberty versus tyranny with a lot of cool technology, a little bit of romance, a lot of action, check out my EMBARK Science Fiction Space Family member with this 7-book completed series. It's great for all ages, 11 plus, written for adults, but I kept the kids in mind. Pick up EMBARK Book 1 today. Go to Amazon.com. Do it. Go right now if you haven't done it already. And just pick up Book 1. Treat yourself a friend or a family member. If you like science fiction, of course you do. You like Star Wars, listen to this podcast. Go check out my series on Amazon.com. Again, Jon Justice, 7 books at all, hardcover, paperback, audiobook, free on Kindle Unlimited as well. And I'll just give you a description of Book 1 before I let you go if this is the first time you're listening to the show. With interstellar travel possible, pilots are the future, and since the passing of her aerospace engineer father, Keitha Morrow has relentlessly trained to be the best. But when an industrial accident sets off an apocalyptic chain of events, she'll need more than her skills to survive. Meanwhile, Taft Guardia picked the right day to upgrade his ship when Keitha arrived, needing his help investigating a cryptic message that she'd suddenly received. As a tyrannical enemy emerges to exploit the disaster, Keitha and Taft discover what may be the only chance of ending the conflict. On the run across the galaxy, Taft gathers a ragtag squadron to join the fight, while Keitha must solve the mystery of what her father left behind and face her past if there is any hope of saving Earth's evacuees before it's too late. So go check out a new science fiction space opera series inspired because of my love of George Lucas, his storytelling, and science fiction. So we'll talk a little bit more about Acolyte, and I want to hear from you. Email me, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. The series is complete. What are your overall thoughts? What did you think about this last episode? Drop a comment on YouTube or TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. I hope wherever you are happy, you're healthy, and you're safe. God bless, and I'll talk to you again next week. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.